Hi, good morning. My name is Artur Gadzhiev. I'm a CG lead at Anyma. Let me start by saying a few words about myself. I've been working with Houdini for many years, and my background comes from several different areas. I spent around 10 years working as an FX artist, creating visual effects for feature films, focusing mainly on simulations and procedural workflows. And then I moved on to motion design, where I spent about 5 years working with a very talented team at MediaWork. And about a couple of years ago, I joined Anyma, where I started creating visuals for large-scale shows. So today I'm going to share my experience working on the visuals for a show at Sphere in Las Vegas. But before we dive into that, I'd like to start with my showreel. It includes some of my favorite projects from the past 15 years. Enjoy. Hey, thank you. So, Sphere. This is probably one of the most challenging projects I've ever worked on so far. It was a live show by Anyma, an electronic project by Matteo Milleri, known for combining music with large-scale visuals. The whole show was designed specifically for a spherical screen, so everything had to work in that format. The creative direction was led by Alessio De Vecchi, who defined the overall look and feel of the project, and I worked on a series of visuals for it. So the first visual is a close simulation created for Seviza. The setup was not extremely complex, but I'd like to show you a few small tricks that helped me avoid resimulating and saved a lot of time during production. The idea was to create flowing ribbons inspired by her dress, something that felt soft and elegant at a massive scale. So, I drew a set of curves as a guide for the future shape. It's not the most typical approach, but I wanted to try and see where it leads. And it turned out to be faster and easier for me to work with the silhouette at the curve level. And then I de-attribute for each curve and duplicated the curves and moved them with a transform. The idea was to spread the curves so the final shape would then give an interesting silhouette. And connected them with a skin, turning the lines into single shapes. But after that, the topology was not yet ready for simulation, so the next step, obviously, was to use remesh. And I made the topology quite dense to get a detailed simulation, and prepared a group for a pin constraint, just to pin points on one side. Okay, so now geometry was ready for simulation. And I used default volume close settings with just a little adjustment. So to add more details. I increased the rest length scale a little. This added an internal cloth reserve, as if there was slightly more material than needed. And at the same time, I reduced band stiffness so that the cloth could break more freely. Here you can see how the simulation changes depending on the settings. And here we can see two problems. First, there were too many folds. I made the geometry quite dense to get the details, but there turned out to be too many of them. And second, the movement was too fast. The weight was lost. At this point, it might have been a good idea to resimulate, which I eventually decided not to do, but to fix everything in post-sim instead. The first thing I did was to slow down the simulation by almost half using retime, and check out how simply reducing speed adds weight to simulation. And I also had the idea to tweak the silhouette a bit and add a little more complexity to the shape. As I mentioned earlier, changing the shape before simulation and trying to get the perfect result was not the approach I went for. So I used a little trick with a soft transform. I selected some points at the base and moved that part down. And thanks to the soft fall-off, the deformation gradient was very smooth, and the shape became more interesting. See how it's super simple, but works really well. And earlier, I showed you that the simulation produced a lot of folds, mainly because the geometry was quite detailed and the surface looked a bit noisy. So to fix that, I used attribute blur to gently smooth the point positions. And this removed some of the smaller wrinkles while keeping the main folds. And I didn't simulate the second part at all. Instead, I just simply rotated the geometry and added a time offset. So it would not feel like a mirror copy. And so this way, I could reuse the same simulation while still getting variation in the motion. And last but not least, at the very end, I bent the entire geometry a little, and this helped the cloth better follow the surface of the sphere and work with perspective. And because the final screen was a sphere, the camera worked a little differently here than in a normal render. Woodblock team, who did most of the show, gave me the camera setup and guides on how to position the geometry. And this was important because the output image looked quite distorted, but that's normal. In other words, what we see here was not the final view for audience. That turned into the correct image on the dome after projection. I won't go into detail about shading and rendering here, nothing too complex, just a few standard passes to control lighting and compositing. I've prepared a close-up, mostly because I just love close-ups, so you can see what the material itself looks like. So yeah, just a few simple tricks, and you can get something that looks really nice. So now let's move from this beautiful look to something quite creepy. Yeah. The idea of the next visual was that the creature should be walking on the outside surface of sphere, and the audience saw it from below, trying to understand what the thing was.
Let me work it, yeah. Put it on me, my hands on your waist. Later you can come over my place. I know that you want me there now. Oh, you wanna party? Listen to your body. I want to get on it. Oh, you wanna party? Listen to your body. I want to get on it. 'Cause I really like the way you. Girl, I really like the way you move. Girl, I really like the way you. Girl, I really like the way you.
So, thank you. So, references combined two ideas. Something alien and organic at the same time, something that looked slightly transparent, almost like a deep-sea organism. The key idea of the visual was that the creature did not just move across the surface, Wherever it stepped, life began to grow. Grass, moss, and small plants started popping up exactly where the creature touched the surface. So instead of being something destructive, the creature actually became a source of life. So I started building the setup. And after a while, this is what I got. Hardly impressive, right? Not exactly the giant creature I had in mind. So I decided to look for similar approaches on YouTube. And I came across a really great tutorial that gave me a solid starting point for building the setup. And from there, I began adapting it to fit the needs of this visual. So let me talk you through the setup. It starts very simply. A grid with the scattered points, and for each point, I keep a rest position and an index attribute. And then I copy a circle onto each point and scatter points on top of the circles. So each point becomes a small cluster of points. And then I calculate a direction vector from the center of each cluster and visualize it to see how the system behaves. This will later determine how the legs are oriented. And next, I define the main motion that drives the overall motion, main point, sorry. It's basically just a point moving through noise, which gives it a more organic feel. I also expose the Y offset as a parameter, so I can animate it later if needed. And here, I am using a little Vex code to build the connection between points. The idea is for each point, I find nearby points and then generate curves between them based on distance and direction. And there are a few parameters controlling this, how far each point can search for neighbors, how many connections it can create, and like some bias values that affect the overall shape and spread. Yeah, and adding some variation using noise, just combining a couple of layered noises and using them to offset the position, so the structure does not feel too uniform. And there is also a ramp controlling the distribution along the y-axis, so the geometry stays more stable near the ground. Okay. At that point, I felt like the structure was getting a bit too dense in the center, so I decided to clean it up and make space for the head. And I trimmed the curves using Carve and selected the base points and lit them with my favorite soft transform. And then beats is randomized, and I used a sweep to generate the final geometry. And this is what it looks like at this stage. Now we can move on to the next part, the head and everything happening inside. Yeah. For the head, it starts from a basic sphere with a mountain to introduce deformation. The amplitude is animated and looped over time, creating a subtle pulsating effect. I wanted to make it look like a living organism, almost like a heartbeat. And at this point, the result was already looking pretty good, but it still felt a bit too rigid. So I decided to add some secondary motion using Vellum. Just selected a small group of points, around 10%, and use them as a soft pins, so they would follow the animation. But Vellum settings are here, pretty much default. And this is the result. And here you can see some additional details. So at this stage, the result seemed complete. So I used point deform to transfer the motion back onto the original geometry. The simulation was done on a subdivided version, but I wanted to keep the original mesh. And since the simulation was built at the origin and didn't include the main motion, the next step was to copy it onto the driving point. Of course, this could have been done in a more physically accurate way, but separating the simulation from the main motion made the system much easier to control. For the internal structure of the head, I used the first frame of the simulation as a base and scattered points inside the volume and connected them with using connect adjacent pieces. And then I resampled and smoothed the curves to create like a softer, more organic structure. And again, used point deform to transfer the motion from the head simulation onto his internal structure, which produced a really nice organic result. Just check this out. So this is what we have at this stage. I was quite happy with it, but it still looked like something was missing. There was some life in the head with a pulsation, but the limbs felt a bit too simple. So I thought it could be interesting to add a sense of blood flow. And here I'm just shifting UVs over time. Nice and simple. I love this one-line wax solutions. And added noise to make it less uniform. The effect was also controlled along the y-axis to keep the lower parts cleaner because the geometry there was quite thin. And here is a preview of the UV flow. At this stage, the internal structure was exposed on the outside. This is one of the early look development options. And later on, the decision was made to move everything inside, so as you could see in the final version. So, at this point, the main system was already working, and I was so happy and pleased with myself. And then, oh shit, I realized that everything was happening on a flat surface, while it actually needed to work on a sphere. The obvious approach would have been to go back and rebuild everything with that in mind, but instead I decided to take a different path. And here I want to take you guys back for a quick flashback. When I was just starting out as a 3D artist, I once saw a question of 3D forum. How do you turn a grid into a sphere? And I remember thinking, well, probably you can't. But to my surprise, someone replied with a really simple solution. And for some reason, that idea just got stuck in my mind. And years later, it randomly came back. And it turned out to be exactly what I needed here. So the solution was to bend the original grid 180 degrees along one axis, and then, surprisingly, to bend it again 180 degrees along the other axis. And that effectively transformed the flat grid into a perfect sphere. Or, if that's what you need, 90 degrees, and you get a hemisphere. So I used exactly these two bend nodes and put them after the entire setup. Yes, I had some concerns that this might cause issues, but thankfully everything worked as I expected, which allowed the whole system to work directly on sphere. So then I moved on to my favorite part, look development, and started testing different material directions. One version was much more transparent than others, almost like the creature was made of glass or some kind of membrane. Another version had stronger subsurface scattering, which made it look much softer or more biological. Also tried a more open skeletal direction where the structure was more exposed. Visually, it was interesting, but it made the creature feel a bit less heavy. And then there was a more textured, earthy option, which pushed it closer to something natural and grounded. And here is a cleaner, more glass-like material. The idea was to make it almost like a transparent shell with some internal glow. It revealed the inner structure nicely, but at the same time, it started to look less organic. I also pushed it into a more colorful direction, but it started to look like a gummy bear, and I decided against it. And here is another transparent look, but with a more uniform color. I also tried a different head design by adding more internal detail. At the same time, I experimented with a strong subsurface scattering to bring back some of that organic look into the material. And here it started to look much more like a living thing. I thought, why not try combining subsurface scattering and transparency? As you can see, the transparency is very subtle, and we almost don't see the internal structure anymore. But it helps to break that solid, dense feeling. And this one is my favorite. This is where it finally starts looking like a real creature. More transparency, less subsurface, revealing the inner structure, and giving it more fragile, organic quality. And at this point, I really like this look. So I did a quick animation test to see what it would look like in the motion. And it worked really well, maybe even too well. It started looking a bit too creepy. So we decided to explore a few other options. So this version had a softer, more neutral organic look, less contrast, less transparency, focusing more on the shape. And this is where we landed in the end. It looked like the right balance between organic and readable, not too transparent, not too dense, just enough to see the internal structure without making it too overwhelming. And this became the final look. Bye. And now I want to switch to something completely different. This visual is called Human Now. It was probably one of the most complex visuals I've ever worked on because of the scale and collaboration involved. We had 3 teams working on it, and the whole sequence was built in about a month. And my role here was less about creating individual effects and more about bringing everything together. I was responsible for assembling the scenes and making sure everything worked as a continuous sequence and preparing it for final rendering, which in a project like this is a challenge in itself. Just imagine around 6,000 frames in 8K. That's absolutely insane. Alessio, our creative director, did a lot of research around the core concept. I won't go too deep into detail, but the main idea is a parallel between humanity and technology. It's about the same system seen from different perspectives across multiple dimensions. And these structures are repeated everywhere, in neurons, in nature, in living systems. So the whole piece becomes a transformation of the same system, from something mechanical to something more human. And we have 2 characters, which both go through transformation throughout the visual. Eva, a robotic entity, which later turns into human, and Matteo, a more abstract quantum version of human, becoming entirely human at some point. And the whole piece follows their transformation across different states. And this is a human version of the characters. The models were created by a super talented artist, Ian Spriggs, and the level of realism here is incredible. And of course, huge credit to the teams involved. Ethos Collective, we are co-directing this piece, handling the camera, direction, and look development. And as I mentioned earlier, Woodblock were the ones who created most of the visuals for the show and supported this one with additional assets and render pipeline setup. So, the first world, Tesseract, was directly connected to that idea of layered realities. And visually, we tried to keep everything very clean and structured. So the contrast between organic shapes and the environment became more visible. And these were some of the very early tests for the first world. At that stage, we were exploring a very clean, white look, but not completely empty, more like a soft haze or fog that gradually reveals the space. And later tests. As you can see, we moved away from the white setup and shifted towards a darker environment. But we kept that idea of haze, still using fog to reveal the space gradually. And this is the final look for this first world. And we named the next world Mirror Room. The key idea here was infinity, endless reflections, endless variations of the same space. It goes back to the idea of multiple realities, where the same system exists in many different versions at once. And these were some of the first look dev explorations. They were about trying to find a visual language for this idea of infinity and multiplication, playing with reflections, light streaks, and how the space can look like it's expanding in all directions. And these were some of early tests for this infinity effect. We were exploring how the space could multiply and extend endlessly. And honestly, I really like this version. It looks a bit like a cover art for black metal album. Not sure how many metalheads we have here. The black and white abstract look feels quite pure. And here is a preview of the transition, where the environment evolves into the next state. And another exploration of the transition, using reflections to transform the space. The environment multiplies through reflections, creating this layered, multidimensional feeling. We did not use it for sphere, but actually worked really well later in the music video. And some style frames as we were getting closer to the final look, still keeping that sense of infinity, but with a clearer structure and direction. And here we focused more on the transformation of the characters themselves. This is also an updated version of the transformation compared to what we did for Sphere. We pushed it further in terms of detail and how the material transition. And here we were exploring different looks for the transformation, starting with something more transparent and very light, and then pushing it a bit further, still transparent but more solid. And it was also about combining those ideas, turning from transparency into a more metallic, almost gold-like surface. And viewport preview of Mateo's transformation. It's all driven by a mask, blending geometry and controlling groom growth. And this is Eva's transformation. It's built in layers. First you see these lines, almost like a metallic structure forming a skeleton. And then on the edge of the transformation, these crystalline elements start forming the skin. Yeah. And this is a transition to the third world. Here we start combining reflections and refractions. So instead of just duplicating the space, we begin to distort it. And for this world, we looked at references that combine multidimensional space with structured forms like cubes, all the while keeping in mind this idea of tesseract, a structure that exists across multiple dimensions. The early tests explored cubes forming a single structure and a tree system inside them, which repeats itself across different dimensions. And this is an animation test for this idea, which was also used in the music video later. And here are some more of my favorite tests, black and white versions, where we started testing how the idea actually works in the space. And here we began introducing color, and adding color helps separate layers and give more depth to the space. Also exploring different levels of detail, how dense the system should feel. But despite how complex it seems to be in the final version, this is what it actually looks like in the Houdini, just fairly simple structure. The final look of the third world is complex, layered, combining reflections and refractions, and this is where everything leads into the final world. The first test of the final part, you clearly see this idea of multidimensionality, and here we're testing different ways of layering the environment and repeating the character within it, and different densities, different patterns of repetition, how they affect perceptions. Started introducing light patterns and dispersion, and also tried a darker, dramatic look, more contrast, more focus on light and silhouette. And this is the final look, minimal space, multiple reflections of the same character. And at some point, the space around her starts collapsing. As she tries to break out, the environment begins to shift and transform. And even though visually it looks quite complex, under the hood, it's actually very simple. It's basically just scaling boxes. So, let's take a look at the result of this final part.
A reflection of eternity. A bond forever and beyond.
Thanks for watching. Thanks, Side Effects, for inviting me, and all of you for coming. Thank you.
Amazing. Any questions? Don't be shy. Yeah.
Hi, great talk, first of all. I was curious, those images you were saying looked like a black metal album. Those felt very not digital and quite organic. How did you get that look?
It's actually it was just a cube. We were inside the box, and everything was done like on the reflections. So and this black and white look, less saturated light. So this is it. Nothing complex.
The grain part of the shader, or how did that effect come by?
What, sorry?
The grain on those black and white images, like it felt very like paper-like.
No, people like. Yeah, I think they did not like this version. We decided to go further to add some variation, color, and like less structure, more straight. Yeah. So, but it is my favorite. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. Fantastic work.
Thank you.
I'm curious about when working with live performances, there is this thing that sometimes you have to match exactly what is happening on the performance. If you were asked to do separate clips to be launched on real time, or you just did the whole video and matching the songs?
First there was sound, there was music, and we did like every visual. It's just 2 or 3 minutes, one clip for a song, without any cuts. So, and especially this one, Human Now, it was like one camera goes through all worlds like seamlessly. So, which was quite painful and hard to go through all different worlds and like combine them because I decided to separate them and work on them like separately, but in the end we just combine them as one whole sequence. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I ask about the toolbox you're using? Like I've seen you are using Houdini and Cinema 4D, but for render, what do you use mostly?
For what, sorry?
For rendering with software.
For render?
Yeah.
For Redshift. This one, all this, I rendered with Redshift.
I see. Thank you.
Excellent. Great presentation, Artur. Thanks so much.
Thank you.